اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد. قال المصنف رحمه الله ورضي عنه: ولو اختلف في الأجل فالقول لنافيه إلا في السلم به يفتى. From here, the Fuqaha or Imam al-Haskafi rahimahullah is discussing the views of the Fuqaha in regard to a dispute or disagreement in the passing or the obligation of a time. So if the contract was extended and it was delayed and deferred, and there's a difference of opinion with regards to this time and this deferral, then what's the ruling? So the first thing is, Imam Haskafi says, look, if there's a dispute, then the one who's rejecting that, lina fihi, is the buyer. He's saying, look, he's the one saying no, and the mushtari is demanding, because the buyer is typically the one who wants to be paid. So it's the view of the buyer is taken the seller, because the asal and de facto principle when it comes to a transaction is that hulul is asal, meaning a contract by fundamentally or originally and by default is not deferred, and it can become deferred when the parties agree. But aslan, a contract is not deferred, and because the seller, the buyer, is what he is saying is aligned to the asal, then his view is taken in fiqh, because that's the most zahir, apparent, and most obvious. So to move away from that, you need a dalil, a beginner. And this is quite common in fiqh, where the contracts and in mu'amalat, uqud and contracts have some usul. They're made on some principles. There's some principles in mu'amalat which uqud have, contracts have. And that's like and this is one such principle where the asal in a bay is hulul, and only when there is ta'jil will there be ta'jil. That's an asal in bay and in uqud. But you can move away from the asal when there is taradi. So there's certain usul which you can move away from when there's taradi, and there's certain usul which you cannot move away from even if there is taradi. How do you figure out which usul you can move away from? That comes with understanding which usul or which principles or which elements are there from shara and which are to do with huquq al-ibad. So we have to understand which elements are from min huquq al-shara and which elements are from min huquq al-ibad. Only when you begin to realize, okay, this is in the boundary of ibad, and a person can agree to do something differently, will it be acceptable. Another example is expenses in a shirkah. This is mentioned by the Fuqaha, and even Mufti Uthmani Hafidhahullah mentions this in Fiqh al-Buyu. The expenses in a partnership aslan are supposed to be shared. So if we have a partnership and we're 50-50, originally and by default, we are both responsible for 50% each of the expenses. However, we can move away from that and agree to something else. That's also permissible. Because this sharing of expenses is not min huquq al-shara, rather it's min huquq al-ibad. You start from 50-50, which is the asl of the contract, but because this issue of paying, it doesn't change the nature of the underlying contract. We're not saying the risk bearing is changing. Rather, we're just talking about expenses. Expenses are tabe, or they don't change the actual essence of the contract. Who bears the expenses? I can bear it voluntary, you can bear it voluntary. It doesn't really matter. Costs and expenses are not central to the essence of something. When that's the case, by changing and by agreeing that I'll bear the expenses or you bear the expenses, we can do that because we are doing tasarruf in our huquq, and the two parties can do tasarruf in their huquq, which is known as isqat. And this is another such example in the kitab right now, where if one partner, or if they agree to do ta'jeel, they've agreed to move away from their haqq together. And this haqq is not something which changes the essence of the contract of bay'. That's why they can do so. So he mentions that the view of the seller will be taken because by default, hulul and the contract being without deferral is the original stance and original position in a contract. By default, and the de facto is every contract has no deferral and delay. Except in salam, because in salam, as we know, salam, ta'jeel is necessary. To have a deferral is necessary. That's part of the salam contract. And therefore in salam, because ta'jeel is asal, whoever is doing da'wah of ta'jeel, their qawl is taken. And the asal is ta'jeel. So it's like whoever is saying ta'jeel, that is the asal, and their view will be taken. وَلَوْ فِي قَدْرِهِ فَلِمُدَّ الْأَقَلِ. If there's a dispute in the amount, okay, how long is the ta'jeel, then in that scenario, the one who is of the view or is taking the stance of the lesser of the two amounts, so one person saying 1 month, the other person is saying 2 months, the one who is claiming 1 month, his view will be taken. Why? Because with all certainty or almost certain that it'll be that, because both are agreeing of 1 month, there's a dispute in anything over and above a month. So because both parties are in agreement to 1 month, that is given dominance and preference. وَالْبَيِّنَةُ فِيهِمَا لِلْمُشْتَرِي. The mushtari will have to give bayyina up here because he's the one who's going against the apparent and obvious, right? وَلَوْ فِي مُضِيِّهِ فَالْقَوْلُ الْبَيِّنَ لِلْمُشْتَرِي. So if there's a dispute and debate في مضي المدة, meaning in the passing of the time frame, or في مضي الأجل up here, في مضي الأجل, in the passing of the time. So if there was 1 month was given and there's a dispute whether the time has lapsed or not, whether it's expired, whether it's matured, that's what the dispute is. Then up here, the view of the mushtari will be taken, and if both parties were to give a bayyina, an evidence, the bayyina of the mushtari will be stronger. Because up here, both of them are in agreement. Both parties are agreeing there is ajal. There is a delay and deferral into payment. And credit has been stipulated. Both are in agreement. The debate is in the actual maturity. When does it mature? So the asal is when both are in agreement of the of deferral. That's the asal. So the contract is deferred by its essence. And the asal then is the remaining of this, unless there's a dalil to show otherwise. Okay. So the mushtari will have to take an oath and swear that the time has not passed. He'll have to take an oath and swear that the time has not passed for his word to be taken, right? Of course, because if there's no dalil, then he has to take an oath when he's saying it's not passed, and if the other party is saying it has passed. So because the asal appear that there is ajal, he has to take the oath up here in it not passing. He's the one who's rejecting the passing of the time frame. And also his bayyina will be taken. When will his bayyina be taken? His bayyina will be taken in preference of the bayyina of the mudda'i. Now there's a difference of views appear in what this actually means. Some fuqaha have mentioned up here that if there's a dispute and between both parties, and both parties have bayyina. They both have bayyina. The bayyina of the mushtari will be stronger because he's now saying in his way that it's not past, so it's closer and more aligned to the asal. So that's why his bayyina will be taken, right? But this is something that will be debated in the courts of qada. Then finally, the Fuqaha mentioned, Imam Haskafi mentions, وَيَبْتُلُ الْأَجَلِ بِمَوْتِ الْمَدْيُونَ الدَّائِنِ. The delay and deferral in the contract or the credit will be nullified by the death of the debtor. It's because the entire benefit of that deal and having a time and having a deferral in the contract is for the benefit of the debtor, because he's the one who has an obligation to deliver. So by delaying his obligation, by giving him some respite, by giving him some time, it's in his favor. And when he's passed away, there is no benefit. So there's no point in having something which is no longer beneficial. This is another kind of principle in Sharia, especially in mu'amalat, that Sharia doesn't give, when something has no fa'idah, Sharia typically doesn't give it any legal ruling or legal recognition. This is also, you'll find this ruling in the discussions of shurut, where if something has no fa'idah whatsoever, it's then and there's no harm either, it's laghu, it's not really considered. Similarly, a similar principle is found in the matters of wakala. If a muwakkil, he stipulates something which is ghair mufid, right, which has no benefit whatsoever, so he's made a stipulation and he's restricted, he's got a wakala muqayyada, restricted wakala, where the wakil is restricted in such a way where the restrictions of no benefit whatsoever, it makes no difference. Then if the wakil was to act and do something differently, as long as it's not harmful, it'll still be acceptable because the initial restriction was without benefit. So the Sharia, as you can see in different chapters of fiqh, the concept of what has fa'idah and what does not have fa'idah is taken into consideration. And when something has no fa'idah whatsoever, it's typically made lagh or redundant and not accepted. And this is a scenario up here where initially there was fa'idah, but when he has no fa'idah, then it's made redundant. Why is that the case? Because mu'amalat and buyu are there for the benefit of both parties. But when there's no benefit whatsoever, there's no need for that law or that principle to continue and exist because there's no benefit. So it's there, Sharia and mu'amalat, the ahkam that we have is there to benefit both parties and to ward them of harm, to ward off harm from both of them, to protect them from harm. If there is no benefit and there's no harm being warded off, then there is no meaning to the condition or that stipulation or for that matter. So here, if the debtor passes away, then the deferral period will be dropped. And the Fuqaha mentioned here, like Imam Ibn Abidin rahimahullah mentions, the whole point of ta'jil is أن يتجر فيؤدي الثمن من نماء المال. The whole point is, if you take on debt, you're supposed to invest that, put it into trade and business, use it as working capital, capitalize it on your balance sheet, put it into your kind of fixed assets and generate wealth. And thereafter, from the produce, you pay off the debt. That's the whole point. When the person passes away, he can no longer do that. So there's no point of ta'jil. Now, Haskafi goes and mentions some furu and some other cases. He mentioned باء بحال ثم أجله أجلا معلوما أو مجهولا كنيروز وحصاد صار مؤجلا. If there's a deferral, or initially he sells on spot, right? Using the word on spot is not always the best, because in the financial markets, you will see sometimes we write the word spot to refer to immediate settlement, right? Or immediate transaction, or a cash transaction. A cash transaction is probably a better term to use than spot transaction, because spot in the financial markets doesn't mean immediate and cash. Spot can be anything from up to T+2, T+3 even. So it is a delay of 2 to 3 days. So whereas up here, that's not what we mean. So sometimes using the word spot is not always the best kind of explanation. Rather, you could use cash transaction for hal or an immediate transaction. So if there's such a scenario where a transaction was done, it was immediate, meaning there was no delay and deferral stipulated, but then ثم أجله, then it was agreed to the seller, he gave some kind of delay and deferral for the buyer to pay. أجلا معلوما أو مجهولا. The time frame was known, for example, 20 days. أو مجهولا, or it was unknown. But here, it's important to remember this majhul doesn't mean majhulan, such majhul which is fahish, or where the gharar is fahish, and it's not jahala fahisha. It doesn't mean that. It means jahala yasira. That jahala which is tolerable. It's yasir. It's tolerated. It's minimal. It doesn't lead to any dispute or discord, to any niza'. Why are we taking this understanding? Because of the examples that is given. Neyruz, hasad. These things can be worked out, figured out. It doesn't really lead to dispute. It's almost as if these things, by looking at these things, or Neyruz, or the hasad, the harvest, both parties have an index, a reference to work out almost the maturity of the transaction and when payment is due. So because both parties have a reference, then they can no longer, well, it's acceptable as jahala yasira. And why is jahala yasira? The Fuqaha mentioned and discussed this. Jahala yasira is typically those things which is in the power and capacity of both parties to remove the jahala. This is another way to understand jahala. There's different ways to understand jahala yasira. One is it doesn't lead to niza', of course. Some have also discussed and described this as that jahala, when the fuqaha are discussing the masail of ta'yin of mabi or ta'yin of thaman and the qadar of thaman, then they discuss this concept of whenever you can rectify something in the contract or at the end of the transaction, the jahala is not mustaqir, and therefore it can be removed. Like the view of Sahibain. The view of Sahibain in certain instances is that if the jahala can be rectified, or if a matter can be rectified in a transaction, even if there was jahala whilst discussing the terms, but it can be rectified whilst they're in the majlis, then there is no taqarrur of fasad. The fasad is not permanent, it doesn't stay, it's dissolved before the parties depart, and it'll be acceptable, it can be rectified. Whereas the view of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was, no, once you agree and the aqd is done, then that jahala is cemented and solidified and can no longer be rectified. You'll have to cancel the transaction and re-perform and redo the transaction without the jahala. So that's another way to understand jahala yasira and jahala fahisha. But nevertheless, up here, we know the examples they're given of Neyruz and Hasad. These are things which are in front of them. They have a somewhat of an idea and understanding. It's in their capacity. So the jahala is yasira. It's not something which is completely unknown. For example, like the blowing of the wind, as the Fuqaha give examples of this, or something which is completely out of their control, completely out of their senses. That jahala is not within their control or within their comfort zone. When that jahala is not in the comfort zone, it'll cause them discomfort, because it'll cause niza', and that jahala will be fahish. So any jahala which there's a reference to it, or there's a formula to work out, and this is what happens typically now in financing contracts and financing agreements, and in large-scale transactions between institutions. Typically, some costs are benchmarked against formulae. Right? There's a formula there to work out the costs, and that is sufficient because both parties can work out. Yes, the contemporary scholars and advisors, they typically put a condition that there should be a ceiling and a floor, so that you bracket the costs. So you put a maximum and a minimum to give a rough idea of where the cost will be bouncing between, right? So where will it be between? So you bracket the cost. If you can bracket it, then the jahala is almost removed, because now you know that it'll be, for example, pegged on this particular index or benchmark or reference rate, and there'll be a ceiling and a floor capping it, so it cannot go beyond these two levels, and that would remove all jahala. Okay. Then he mentions له ألف من ثمن مبيء فقال أعطي كل شهر 100 فليس بتأجيل بزازية. He mentions that if a person is owed 1,000, right, pounds, and he says to the buyer, just give me every month 100 pounds. They are mentioning this is not a form of ta'jil, because he's agreed to be paid 100 pounds a month. This is not an evidence of ta'jil. This is purely an amr of installments, but it's not an amr of ta'jil, meaning he's giving him an order and concession to pay in installments, but the entire debt is still hal. It's still all binding, but he's just given him installments. So just by having installments doesn't necessarily mean all the time that your debt has a delay in deferral. It doesn't mean that. The entire debt is all binding right now. He can take you to court. Like, how do you work this out? What's the kind of net result and outcome of this? And the thamara of this? The thamara is he can take you to court and demand all of it. That's the thamara. Whereas if it was mu'ajjal and delayed and deferred, he could not do that. He would have to abide by the deferral that has been stipulated. But because this is not a delay and deferral, rather this is purely a concession, then he can remove the concession unilaterally when he wants and take you to court and get all the money, and you'll have to pay him. You'll be responsible to pay him as soon as he demands it. Of course, it'll be somewhat discouraged from his side. If he gave you his word, it was more like a promise and concession, and then he went against that. Yeah, that's going against his word, which is problematic. But legally and hukman, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the court, he has the right and opportunity and permission to demand his full payment when he wants, if there's no ta'jil. Then they mention عليه ألف ثمن جعله ربه نجوما إن أخل بنجم حل الباقي فالأمر كما شرط ملتقط. He mentions another scenario where if a person has to pay, right? He has to pay. So the buyer in this scenario, he has to pay somebody 1,000 pounds. جعله ربه نجوما. The owner who's owed, the creditor, he says to him, look, pay me monthly. This is what nujuman means, right? Pay me monthly. In أخل بنجم حل الباقي. He says, look, if you miss, and the way he made it binding monthly was that if you default and delay in paying any month, then all of the installments become binding legally. And I can take you to court and demand all of the payments immediately. This is acceptable. فَالْأَمْرُ كَمَا شَرَطَ. The dealing and the matter in this scenario will be as has been stipulated. This is known as khiyar al-naqd in fiqh. This is an example of khiyar al-naqd, which means you have an option, you put in an option whereby you allow somebody to, there's two scenarios of this actually. One scenario is where one khiyar al-naqd is where you put in, you make a sale on deferral and say, look, if you don't pay by this particular date, then the contract is fasid and void. That's one example the Fuqaha give khiyar al-naqd. This is another scenario, another type of example, which I recall reading somewhere, where the contract doesn't become fasid, but the contract becomes naqd and cash, where it's now binding, all the installments become due and payable. So that's another scenario up here. And this is known as acceleration in legal terms. It's a clause of acceleration, which is also acceptable. وهي كثيرة الوقوع, right? And he mentions, look, this happens often. Now from here onwards, he begins to discuss matters to do with coins, and currencies losing their status as a currency. Like what happens, which payments are due, especially when there's debt owed. Because we're talking about ajal, credit, and deferral, what happens if there is an issue with the currency? So he mentions قلت ومما يكثر وقوعه ما لو اشترى بقطع رائجة فكسدت بضرب جديدة أو بضرب جديدة يجب قيمتها يوم البيع من الذهب لا غير. He mentions, okay, another scenario which takes place often is, what if a person, he buys something using currency which was in circulation, coins which were in circulation, فكسدت. This is a technical term in fiqh. Kasad and inqita, these are two words. Kasad refers to when a coin stops being legal tender or is no longer accepted. It's basically taken out of acceptance and no longer recognized by the order of the sultan and the hukam and the authorities. For example, if it's a royal mint or the authorities in charge of monetary policy, they change the currency, right? And so a coin or a particular payment method is no longer recognized as a legal tender, can no longer be used at all in mu'amala. Why? What's the sabab of that? It says بِضَرْبِ جَدِيدَةٍ, because a new coin is issued. There's a new coin that's issued, or new coins are issued, and the old coins are no longer recognized. So whoever has the old coins cannot be used as legal tender. They're no longer deemed to be a currency and nuqud. And so when that's the case, the question arises, okay, and remember, in those times, every coin had a value, because the face value of a coin and its inherent intrinsic value were almost identical, in that because coins, dinar and dirham, were weighed. They were weighables. They were not countables. So if a 20 dinar was a weight, 10 dinar was a weight, 200 dirham was a weight, because the amount of silver in there was valued that much, and that's how much it weighed. And that could, whereas today, you can have a 50-pound note, saying 50 pounds, but the face value of the note has more value than the actual worth of the paper. So the intrinsic value of the paper versus the face value is different in today's money, in the fiat currency. It only has a value it holds because of the government's promise and the government's recognition of this as the legal tender. That's the only thing, that the government has made this binding. It has no other way or nothing inherent or intrinsic within it to give its face value and worth. Whereas in those days, the coins themselves inherently, intrinsically had gold and silver, which gave it its worth and value. So what it said on its face was reflected in itself. It had, for example, 500 pounds worth of gold in it. And that's why the coin, the face value would be 500, because the coin is worth 500, as an example. So up here, if there's coins where have become are no longer legal tender, and the ghalib is gold and silver, not ghish. There's no alloy. The ghalib is not alloy. Rather, the ghalib here, predominantly they're made of gold and silver. The fuqaha differ and debate that what is binding now, because if there is a difference, what if, because it's not full gold, silver, and there's some alloy in there could be some discrepancy in its value to what it's actually worth internally. So the qima could potentially be different in the market. It could be sold for something else. Which value will be taken? How do you work this out? So there's a difference of opinion. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah says in this scenario, the bay becomes batil, because the money is no longer existing. It has no wujud, it's finished, it's no longer, there's kasad there. So the iwad is ma'doom, and that makes the bay batil. Because for a bay to be in existence, both sides of the bargain and transaction have to be present. But when one side is ma'doom, then the bay becomes batil. Whereas Sahibain say, no, the bay does not become batil. Rather, the issues here of taslim. The bay was done, the issues of taslim. What does this buyer deliver? Which amount does the buyer deliver? That's where the debate is and discussion. Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah says that you take the qima, right? The qima, the market value of this particular coin. What was it worth in the market? Like if you were to exchange it, what would you get? And you take the market value of which day of the transaction. You take the market value of the day, because up here what's happened, a transaction took place, let's say on 1st of January, and it became, or was it was no longer recognized, and it was removed as currency on the 1st of February. So this 1 month difference, do you take the value of this coin on the 1st of February or January or the 1st of February? Imam Abu Yusuf says, no, you take it on the 1st of January. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah says, no, you take it on the 1st of February when it was no longer recognized and when it was removed as being legal tender. Because it could be a discrepancy between the two. Imam Abu Yusuf, of course, says that the counterparty was due the actual value on the day he made the transaction. Whatever it was worth then, that's what he was entitled to. To move away from that will be unfair on him. Imam Muhammad says, no, to make it easy for people, and this was more like a taysir fatwa, it was the last thing which people transacted with, and something which is the easiest reference point for all parties to resolve this matter is the last day. The last day when this was a legal tender. That's when you know, because that's the day when you will be exchanging, you'll be potentially giving these coins back into the royal mint or to the government authorities to exchange these coins for something else, or taking it to the wherever you have to take it to exchange it for new coins when the new coins are issued. So everybody will know the value of the coin at that time. When everybody knows the value of the coin at that time, it'll be easy to work out the amount owed in the new coins to your seller, your counterparty. That's what's being discussed here. This is إذ لا يمكن الحكام الحكم بمثلها لمن السلطان منها. It's not possible for the authorities to give or to rule to give its mithal or something similar, because the sultan is not allowed this thing to be in circulation anymore. It's been removed. So how can you give its mithal? You have to now move to something else. That's why they say go to dhahab as an example and work out the value of that in dhahab, in gold, and then give that, or give whatever value it corresponds to. ولا يدفع قيمتها من الفضة الجديدة لأن ما لم يغلب غشها فجيدها ورديئها سواء إجماعا. He mentions up here then that he will not give the value of it from silver as long as ما لم يغلب غشها. Okay. Up here now he's referring to another point up here, which is that when the coin, it's not dominated by ghish, alloy, metals, right? Then it can't be in the ruling, well, whatever the فَجَيِّدُهَا وَرَدِيئُهَا سَوَاء. The value or the quality of the coin will not be taken into consideration. What does this mean? This refers to an entire discussion in fiqh, especially in the chapters of riba and sarf, where whenever a coin has some ghish, alloy, but predominantly is gold or silver, then, and you're exchanging these riba assets, you're exchanging gold, silver, or gold for gold, silver for silver as an example, the alloy is not considered. The alloy is non-existent, because you can't say and you can't trade one gold coin for another gold coin which has just say it's 990 is its purity mark, right? And the other gold coin is 999 purity mark. You can't say that, oh yeah, because this has got, you know, 9 more purity in this particular coin, then I'm taking this with a discount. You can't do that. Or, you know, I'm taking addition. I'm taking more gold from you. So if I've got 999 gold purity with the purity mark of 999, and you have something with 990, I can't demand more from you, more gold from you, if I'm exchanging that. And they're both coins, right? The value, as long as the weight is the same, that's the key thing up here. The weight of both coins, because that was what was used for riba. It was the wazn when it came to gold, right? It was the weight and jins. So as long as the weight is the same, then you can't add anything extra. So you can't say, oh yeah, but up here I'm losing out because my coin is more pure than yours. You can't take anything in addition. But that's what it means for jayiduha wa radi'uha sawa. Even if there's some impurity or some alloy in the coin, it's not pure as the other coin. But as long as the weight is the same, you can't trade it in different value and quantums, because this is everything to do with riba. In the matters of riba, the Nas and Sharia has discounted value. Riba is in the weight and volume. It's not in the value. There's no kind of the value has not been recognized up here in the sense of purity, right? So the purity and its kind of quality, let's say quality to the value, the quality has not been recognized up here. The quality, it's completely overlooked. There's no recognition of the quality. Rather, it's a quantity which has to be equal. The quantity has to be equal. The question arises that why is that the case? Imam Sarakhsi rahimahullah discusses very nicely in his book, where he talks about how, due to Nas, we have dropped the recognition and value of the quality in a riba transaction. So there's no recognition of the difference in quality as long as the quantity, there is mumathala. Mumathala in what? The quantity of riba assets. That's the key thing. So if there's and that's done through either weight or volume in wazn or kale, in qadr. So there's a very nice discussion there that from a Sharia perspective, this the saying of jayiduha, or there's a jayiduha radi'uha sawa, that's removed and dropped recognition of the quality of the coins that you're trading. Okay, so that's what this means. Inshallah, we'll stop here and we'll carry on from أمام غلبة غشه وفيه خلاف. سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم